Hi, my name is Arthur Santos, Seeding and Tillage Marketing Manager for AGCO North America.
And I'm Jason Lee, Field Agronomist for AGCO, and today we'd like to welcome you to the 2020 Fendt Momentum Virtual Crop Tour. At AGCO, we started our crop tour studies and events back in 2016 with the intent to study different variables that occur during and after planting that impact yield potential. Some of the variables we've tested over the years include planting at various depths, singulation studies, and the impact that Downforce has on compaction and yield potential. We've learned a lot from these field trials over the years, and we've shared that with local plots and by summarizing and aggregating the data and sharing it through our websites and social channels.
That's right, Jason. This year, we've launched a planter that was designed to help growers achieve better accuracy, long-term agronomic benefits, and to enable greater control to plant when we need to, with our all-new Fendt Momentum planter. With the launch of this planter, we thought a similar approach to what we've done over the last few years with crop tours could not be a more fitting platform to prove out the benefits of the Fendt Momentum planter. So we did just that. This year, we used our Fendt Momentum planter to put out 5 plots across North America. This included plots in North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Illinois, and Ohio. Amongst these sites, we conducted various tests using the Fendt Momentum planter, including tests of singulation, downforce, and highlighting the impact that compaction have on overall plant health and yield potential.
That's right, Arthur, and with that compaction theme, we really wanted to answer 3 main questions from our crop tour sites this year. Number 1 is, do we see yield loss in the center section of a central fill planter? We all know that the center section of a central fill planter carries a lot of weight. So is there a yield loss as a result of that? Number 2 is, does pinch row compaction cause yield loss? Nearly every row crop planter in the market has pinch rows that are created by a dual tire configuration, whether that's from the tractor or the planter. So we wanted to better understand if that is something we should mitigate or eliminate with a different design. And lastly, we wanted to see if we can mitigate the yield loss that comes with high capacity central fill planters, particularly there in the center section of that planter. So Arthur, while we would have loved to have been out there meeting with growers and showcasing the results in person at each of our plots with all of you, for obvious reasons, we've elected to bring this to you in a virtual format. We've harvested and collected data from all 5 of the plots to highlight our results, but we're gonna go in the field from one of our plots in Chillicothe, Ohio, and share what we've learned with you there. So let's get to it and let's head to the field.
The way a planter puts the seed in the ground is one of the most important factors to the yield that a single seed can produce. And because we believe in that, AGCO hosted over 50 crop tour events all over the world. We've done it in North America, South America, Africa, and Europe. So we would cover lots of different environments, soil, weather, and get as close as possible to your reality. In these plots, we compare extreme with optimal. And we compare the yield and the cost so you can take the most out of the field and make more money out of it. Welcome to the first Fendt Momentum Virtual Crop Tour event, hosted from Chillicothe, Ohio at the Browns Farm. My name is Arthur Santos and I'm the Seeding and Tillage Marketing Manager at AGCO, and I'll be introducing the event for you. First, Derek Russer, Field Product Specialist, who in conjunction with the AGCO Agronomy team oversaw 2 crop tour sites here in Ohio, will go over the first 3 protocols: planting depth, singulation, and downforce. Then, Dr. Jason Lee, our lead agronomist for the crop care team in North America, will present an overview of soil compaction, and then talk about pinch rows and affected rows. After that, I'll come back and we'll have a discussion on what can growers do to mitigate soil compaction. Larry Custer, Senior Marketing Product Specialist, will then present an overview of the Fendt Momentum planter, the most advanced planting system in the market, powered by precision planting. And once he explains the unique weight management system we call Low Logic, Jason Lee will come back and we'll talk about our soil compaction protocol. All crop tour sites in North America were brought to yield according to a harvest plan. so we can have the agronomic data as clean as possible and presented to you. Closing our event, I'll come back to recap the main takeaways of our presentation and wrap up the event. Remember, we want you to put that seed on the ground the best way possible, and we want you to do it every year. And this is why we are here today. Thank you.
Hey guys, we're all guilty of it. We all have that perfect planting window opportunity. First day of spring. We're out setting our corn planter to the right depth for that day. But what are we doing the rest of the 10 days that we're planting? Are we changing that planting depth? What if I told you that for some of the folks out here, you guys are losing $50 an acre because of the choices that you've made of not changing our planting depth to the right planting depth for the moisture content in the ground or for the growing season that we're going to be in. Hi, I'm Derek Reeser, Field Product Specialist with AGCO. I'd like to welcome you to our planting depth study. So what do we want out of the right planting depth? We want uniform emergence, and we ultimately want those nodal roots to find moisture and to be able to develop no matter what type of growing season that we have come July or August. In these plots, we measured 17 feet 5 inches. That's 1/1000th of an acre. We counted our stand in each of these plots. We counted 34 plants. So we know we had a good emergence. But most agronomists recommend that you plant at least 1.5 inches deep. And why is that? What we've found throughout our crop tour locations is that it's for root development. Why do you want good root development? Most years, we have a great weather planting for the springtime, but when we get to July, we get to August, usually we run out of moisture. So we want a good developed root system. That way we generate the most yield possible. What I have here is an example of our 1-inch planting depth. What we have is tip back, and there's a reason we have tip back. And so what that is the ear didn't develop kernels all the way to the end of the ear itself. That can happen because of root development problems, which ultimately lead to moisture problems, and sometimes it can be caused because of stress on the plant itself. We had a stressful growing season this year, and because the 1-inch planting depth didn't let our corn plants develop the correct nodal root system, we lost yield potential. So everything we've talked about so far is what we're finding here in Chillicothe, Ohio. But over the last 4 years, with over 50 field trials done, we have found a 14 bushel per acre loss between planting at 1.5 inches and planting at 1 inch deep. We're leaving potential yield out in the field. With today's commodity prices, that's upwards of $50 per acre that we're leaving out in our fields by not planting at least 1.5 inches deep. So do you see a difference in the corn on my right and my left? On my right, I have a 3.5 inch planting depth. On my left, I have 3-inch planting depth. Let's talk a little bit about what we found in this plot. 6 bushels an acre. That's the yield difference we found between a 3.5 inch planting depth and our 3-inch planting depth. So what are some of those factors that led to such a difference there? Well, we had runt plants from uneven emergence. We also had plants that didn't even emerge at all. So we actually found that the 3.5 inch planting depth gave us a population of 25,000, where the 3-inch planting depth gave us a population of 34,000. That's exactly what we were looking for. So in Chillicothe, Ohio, we had some pretty unique yield results. That's because we had a really dry growing season. Typically, we find that planting depth of 2 inches will provide the maximum yield potential for your seeds. We know that the planting depth is a simple item to set, but it's such a critical piece to maximizing your yield. So now let's go talk about Downforce and the effect that it has to make sure that that row unit is to depth the entire way across the field. All right guys, we're here in our Downforce plot. So what we do here is we have 3 different protocols. So we do automatic downforce, we do light downforce, and heavy downforce. Soil type and condition changes across the field. What systems are you using right now to maintain that seed to depth? Do you use spraying, airbags, or do you use a hydraulic system? So in our downforce plot, we try to mimic a light spring downforce system as well as a heavy duty downforce system on a spring setup. This has been a really unique year because of the growing season we've had. So I'd like to talk you through a little bit about what we see when we make those changes in the monitor. So typically on light downforce, what we find is that that seed is not getting placed to the right depth. There's not enough force to keep it there. That in turn leads to about a 13 bushel per acre loss over every acre. So we talked about light downforce. What about too much downforce? So when we have too much downforce, we compact that seed trench. And when we compact the seed trench, the seed root systems will grow in the path of least resistance. Most of the time, it'll develop hatchet roots. Therefore, it limits those roots' ability to uptake water and nutrients. So what does it look like from a root perspective when we have too much downforce? So what we're looking at here is root development, and this is too much downforce. And what we typically see when you have too much downforce is a root grouping that follows the channel of path of least resistance, and in this case was the seed trench. So you can see here these roots developed right in that seed trench because we had too much compaction of the trench itself by having too much force on the row unit. Maintaining seed depth is crucial for yield. You know, it's been our experience out here that if you're gonna err on the heavy side. You know, like I mentioned earlier, we have the ability to lose up to 13 bushels per acre on our light and up to 2 bushels per acre on too much downforce. So we've talked about planting depth, and we've talked about how to get that seed to the correct depth. Now, let's go spend some time about where we're gonna place that seed to maximize your yield potential. So we're here in our singulation plot. So we started off the discussion today about planting at the right depth. We've also talked about keeping that seed at the right depth no matter the soil condition. Lastly, I'd like to talk to you about seed spacing. So to create this, what we've done is have something that we like to call a goof plate. What a goof plate is just a regular corn plate, but we fill in 2 holes and we drill 2 extra holes. Effectively, we have the same population, we just have the spacing mixed up on that plate. You can see on my right here the stand that we have from a goof plate. But first, let's talk about doubles versus skips and the effect that has. So here, you can see a double. The double, what it will do is create 2 smaller ears. You do not have the same amount of yield on these 2 small ears as what you would have on an evenly spaced ear here. Okay, so let's talk about a skip. A skip produces no ear whatsoever. Even though these ears flex, they still can't make up for what that corn plant would produce. Over here you can see evenly spaced stalks. What that turns into is evenly spaced ears that all have the same amount of ability to grow correctly and to produce a consistent ear all the way across the field. This consistent ear leads to higher bushels per acre. So over the last 4 years, we found about a 6% reduction in singulation equals to about a 5 bushel per acre loss. Guys, thanks for taking the time with me today to talk about planting depth, how we keep that planter at that depth, and the seed spacing itself. Let's send it over to you, Jason. Thanks.
Thanks, Derek. That was some really solid information.
Yeah, it was.
I guess it just goes to show how important it is that we make sure that we get everything right during the planting operation.
Definitely. Now let's head back to the field and learn a little bit more about compaction and compaction management with Jason.
Hi, I'm Jason Lee, an agronomist with AGCO, and today we're going to have a brief discussion on soil compaction and how it's impacting your bottom line. Right now I'm standing in one of our soil compaction plots, and in this particular plot we've purposely created a lot of soil compaction by increasing the air pressure on our tires and not having a weight transfer system on our planter, which is very common to what we would experience in a lot of fields in North America. And so before we talk about that, let's take a quick step back and talk about what a healthy soil is and why it's important to maintain a healthy soil. And so if we think about a typical silt loam soil, for example, that soil is made up of 50% pore space and also 50% solid material. But if we think about the pore space in that soil, The pore space is what is filled with air and water, which is really important for the soil's ability to store water and nutrients to support a crop. Well, anytime we drive a piece of equipment across a field, what we are doing to that healthy soil is we're compressing all of those soil particles and we're reducing our pore space. And we're also increasing the density of that soil as well. So what is happening to that healthy soil and what's happening to the roots then as we do that? Well, as we lose pore space in the soil and we increase the density of the soil, our roots have to exert a greater force to be able to penetrate and explore that soil. If we also think about the effect that lack of pore space has in the soil, what happens after a rainfall? So if we don't have any pore space and we get rain falling on top of this soil, without pore space, that water cannot infiltrate down throughout the soil and absorb into that soil and be available for this crop. Instead, we get a lot of runoff, which can increase our chances for erosion and also nutrient runoff as well. Soil compaction also restricts the availability of some nutrients as well. And so some of the common nutrient deficiencies that we'll start to see in corn as a result of soil compaction is nitrogen and potassium, which are very important for producing a high yield. And so since we have this restricted root development underground, obviously that's got to have an impact on what we see above ground. One of the most obvious symptoms of soil compaction is stunted plant height. And as a result of stunted plant height, we'll usually see a pretty major yield reduction as a result of that. So overall, we've talked about the consequences of compaction, how it restricts root development and prevents the soil from absorbing water and also limiting some nutrient availability. Well, the big overarching consequence of compaction is it prevents the soil from providing enough water and nutrients to the plant. And as a result of that is where we get a lot of the yield loss from soil compaction. So the big question then is, how much does this affect my yield? So we talked about a little bit before, and on average, soil compaction will reduce corn yield by about 15%. However, that's going to depend on a lot of different factors from field to field and from year to year as well. So soil compaction is going to depend, and the severity of soil compaction is going to depend on soil moisture conditions, soil type, the amount of organic matter that we have in our soil, and of course also the equipment. But on average, a general rule of thumb is about 15%, but in some extreme cases it can be upwards to 60%. However, the more important take-home message here is the lasting effects that soil compaction can have on our yield. Compaction is not a standalone issue in one single year, so we can't think about compaction as I create a lot of compaction in this year, and then I have the winter season, the off season, and then next year I have a clean slate with no compaction. That's just simply not how it works. And if we have some severe compaction, those effects can last in the soil for several years, even decades, and will affect yield for decades as well. And so that's why we really need to be concerned about soil compaction, because it will have long-lasting effects when we think about how we can sustain high yields for years to come. So now that we've covered the basics of soil compaction and the effects that it can have on yield, let's take it a step further and talk about how current planters on the market today can create compaction. Let's start with pinch rows. So if we think about planters on the market today, a lot of them will have rows where there are tire tracks on both sides of that row. And as a consequence of that, we really restrict the root growth on both sides of that corn row, which obviously will limit that plant's ability severely to uptake nutrients and water. But what about affected rows? Affected rows is a term we like to use to point out the rows where there's only tire tracks on one side of that row. And although the yield effect won't be as dramatic as what we find in pinch rows, we need to still recognize that the affected rows, since there is compaction on one side of that row, they are still being affected to some degree by soil compaction. And so if we take into account both the effect of pinch rows and the effect of affected rows, and we add in the fact that central fill planters carry a lot of weight directly there on the center of the planter, right above those transport wheels, we really exacerbate the effects of pinch row compaction and affected row compaction. So now the $1 million question is, how do we alleviate the effects of pinch row compaction and affected row compaction caused by our central fill planters?
Well, Jason, we just had a great presentation about the problem of soil compaction and the impact that that could have to yield. So let's talk now what growers can do to avoid that problem.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that you can do on your home farms to help alleviate and minimize soil compaction. The number one way that we can avoid and prevent severe soil compaction is to not do any field work when soil conditions are too wet. So anytime we go in a field, especially when we go into plant, we need to really check the soil moisture level to make sure that the conditions are fit. So one thing that I like to do anytime before I start to plant is grab a chunk of soil and roll it up in my hand and get a good soil chunk in my hand, and then I go to pinch that, and if the soil falls apart and crumbles, chances are it's really good conditions to plant, and we're not going to create a lot of compaction. Now if I squeeze that soil clump and I get a lot of smearing and the soil ball doesn't fall apart, chances are that means that soil is a little bit too wet, and we're going to get a lot of smearing, and we're going to create a lot of soil compaction. That's one good thing to check before we do any field work, and it's going to help alleviate soil compaction.
Well, we all know we need to plant in fit conditions, right? But waiting for those perfect conditions, it's not always an option, right? In fact, every year it seems like our planting window is getting narrower and narrower and harder to find the perfect spot.
Yep, especially when we think about a year like 2019, where we had really a lot of frequent rainfall events in the springtime. It was really challenging to get to find that optimum planting window. So the second thing we can do to help minimize compaction is to reduce the overall weight on our planter. So particularly the weight right there in the center on those transport wheels, where all the weight is concentrated from the central fill seed hopper and liquid fertilizer tank. If we can reduce that weight, we take weight off the wheels and we're going to do less compaction. So what are some ways we can do that? Well, number one is we just don't fill the seed tanks as full, right? We don't fill our seed tanks as full, we don't fill our liquid fertilizer tanks as full, and so we're not going to have as much weight on our planter. The second option would be to go back to like a box planter. So a box planter, it's a little bit lighter, and we're going to help, and it'll also help spread the weight out more evenly across the entire planter frame. So those are a couple of things we can do to reduce the overall weight carried on our planter.
Well, those are options, but we are actually going on the opposite side of efficiency, right? There are certainly some drawbacks with those two alternatives, and we just talked about narrow planting windows.
Yeah, certainly we never want to sacrifice our productivity and efficiency, but the third option that we can do to help alleviate soil compaction is our tire size and our tire placement on our planter, right? So when I talk about tire size, if we can get a larger diameter tire or a wider flotation tire, that obviously will help with a larger footprint and help reduce compaction as well. But what about tire placement, right? Most of our planters on the market today have a lot of, will have row units with tires on both sides of that row. Whereas if we could, go to more of like an inline tandem, let's say, or a single track system that's always going to follow the same tracks as the tractor, that's another way that we can help alleviate compaction. One thing to keep in mind is that 70 to 80% of compaction is created on the first pass. And so that means the tractor is going to do a lot of that damage. And so we want to utilize the path that tractor creates and have our planter tracks follow the tractor tracks. And so we're keeping the damage and the soil compaction localized to as few of tracks as we possibly can.
One thing to keep in mind is that changing the tire placement in a planter is not just something we can do, right? Even on the tractor is not something as simple. So we better remember this and think about this when we are getting our new equipment.
So the fourth thing that we can do is adjust our tire pressure. That's the one of the easiest things that we can do to minimize soil compaction is have a reduced tire pressure. Okay, so when we have a lower tire pressure, we increase the length of that footprint. So we have the same amount of weight carried over a larger footprint. And what that's going to do is that's going to help reduce surface compaction.
Yeah, the thing in this recommendation is how practical it is for a grower to go and inflate and deflate every single tire on the planter, on the tractor, right? We are talking here about the time that we have and the crunch of the time that we have, and how practical it is, right? Who really will go back and inflate and deflate the tire between the work in the field and as we transfer from field to field?
When we think about a central fill planter, you know, we have all that weight, and we mentioned this a little bit before, but we have all that weight focused on one spot of the planter. If we could spread that weight out evenly, we're going to reduce weight off the middle and spread it out to the wings. So another option is to utilize a planter with a weight transfer system to help reduce some of that compaction.
Yeah, the problem with the currently available weight transfer systems in the market is it's knowing when to transfer the weight, not only knowing when, but knowing what weight do we transfer, right? And even if we knew what weight to transfer, after we've done it, how do we confirm that we've successfully transferred it and how effective that will be? So this is it's not a closed loop, right? It's something that it's almost a transfer guess.
So the final thing that you can do on your home farms to help alleviate compaction is maybe use a planter with tracks. So tracks is going to help with a larger footprint and help reduce compaction. Now, it's important to remember though that when we compare tracks to tires, if we have a properly deflated tire, so if we have a low tire pressure, that's going to be equivalent to tracks in terms of soil compaction. So tracks will really only provide a significant benefit if you have tires that are significantly overinflated.
Tracks can definitely be a benefit on the compaction side, but when we start thinking about the maintenance of a track compared to a tire, especially when we talk about roading and limiting the roading speed, that is definitely a disadvantage.
Yep. So before we wrap up here, there is one other thing that I think we need to discuss, and that's, you know, let's not just focus on compaction as it relates to the planter. I know that's been a big discussion here today, but we need to be focused on it with all of our equipment that is going to run in a field, right? So we need to be thinking about that with all of our equipment choices going down the road, is how do I manage compaction with all of my equipment? Welcome back, everyone. That was sure a fantastic discussion around compaction management, and I really can't emphasize enough how important compaction really is out there.
Couldn't agree more. Now let's turn back to Larry Custer, Senior Marketing Specialist, that will walk us through the Fendt Momentum planter and talk to us about some of the benefits that it can provide to growers.
Hi, I'm Larry Custer, Senior Marketing Specialist with AGCO Seed and Tillage Group. It's my opportunity today now to talk to you about Momentum and the problems that Momentum addresses, problems we've learned and heard about here today. The engineering and product development team that created Momentum, they were given a clean piece of paper and said, create the perfect planter. That's pretty rare in an engineer's career, to get a clean piece of paper and the opportunity to create. This group, every one of them on this team, are farmers. So they know the problems that growers face in dealing with compaction and all the other problems that are apparent in planting. So the solutions and approaches and applications they've all experienced, and you'll find them in Momentum. So pinch row compaction, which is a serious problem, is addressed with Momentum by not creating them in the first place. Momentum has got what we call inline tandems. Rather than having tires side by side, like most planters today, inline tandems, one tire in front of the other. The tires are large, they're wide, and they create a big footprint, which puts less pressure on the surface of the soil. So they also talked about some of the things that you can do to avoid pinch row compaction and compaction in general with the planter. Weight management systems were mentioned, and inflation systems. If you don't have an inflation system on your planter or your tractor, just letting air out of the tires once you get to the field and filling them back up again once you reload the planter or get ready to travel down the road. True, these are solutions, but I don't know any grower that's going to take time to do that. Well, with Momentum, the engineering group created what's called smart frame technology. And in smart frame technology, a couple of features actually. One of them is load logic. Load logic is an automated weight management system Yes, you could look at it and see cylinders on the wings, between the wings and the center frame. It looks like everybody else's weight transfer system, but the similarities in there. Load logic has two modes of operation. It has controlled traffic and load balance. Let's talk about load balance first. Load balance, in this mode, the weight is evenly distributed over all 6 tires. The system is totally automatic, and this is how it works. At each wheel location, the spindle is actually a weigh bar. We call them smart spindles. They're constantly taking the weight that is on that spindle, on that wheel, and transferring or transmitting that information to the processor. Also at each location is an air pressure sensor that is reading the air pressure in the tire. That information in the processor is being compared to information that was supplied by the tire manufacturer to give us the information that we need to operate the tire at the lowest possible air pressure with the weight that's present at the moment. And I say at moment because weight is always changing and momentum is always reading and adjusting to that change in weight. So at each tire, whatever that weight is, we're inflating to the lowest possible pressure, even down to 15 PSI. Now the way this works, and it can only work this way, is because the tires that are on Momentum are extremely advanced technology. It's a VF technology called Very High Flexion. These tires can operate with the same amount of weight as a standard radial tire, but at 40% less air pressure. So that enables us to get that weight, carry that weight, and get it down to an extremely low air pressure. As Jason Lee explained, the lower the air pressure, the less impact to the soil that the planter is going to generate. So that is the key to load logic. That's the key to weight balance. The other mode, controlled traffic, is really just what the name implies. A lot of farmers today are doing just that. They're controlling the pass of really every operation across the field, be it planting or fertilizing or application with chemicals for weed control. Whatever that pass is, that equipment is staying in the same tracks, controlled traffic. With Momentum, we're actually pulling the weight now off of the wings, concentrating it in the center where that tractor's pass has already taken place. We leave about 900 pounds on each wing. Here's the hook on Momentum and the wing tires. In controlled traffic or load balance, either mode, that wing tire is operating in the same row going down. You make the headland turn and come back, and the wing tire is in the same row coming back, eliminating an additional tire track across the field with every pass. Things we can do to avoid compaction. One of the things was mentioned was not filling the planter to capacity. Well, sometimes that's okay, and other times, you know, that's kind of why we bought a planter with the capacity that it has, is to utilize it. Well, Momentum has a lot of capacity, 130 bushel seed capacity. There's an optional 1,000 gallon liquid fertilizer tank, so the capacity is there. The nice thing about Momentum is that with load logic, you can use that capacity. You can make use of it. By having the management system to control the planter's impact on the soil with a full capacity of the planter. With Momentum, you'll be planting more acres with fewer stops to fill. We learned from Derek Reeser the importance of planting to depth, determining where that moisture line is and planting to that depth and maintaining it. Momentum accomplishes this with the vertical contouring toolbar and Delta-Force. It's really quite a combination. Momentum, when you look at Momentum, it looks like the planter actually has 2 toolbars. But the larger, the 10 by 10 frame, is actually the chassis. That never leaves the ground. The second toolbar where the row units are on, that is called the vertical contouring toolbar. Where most planters, they've got 11.5 or at most 16 inches of vertical movement, row unit travel. Momentum has 16 built into that row unit. But the vertical contouring toolbar, in its ability to follow ground contours, takes that 16 inches and increases it to 68 inches of vertical contouring toolbar movement. So Momentum will not, in virtually any application, not be able to maintain seeding depth. Narrow transport. If you look at the inline tandems, you'll notice that the back tire is much larger than the front tire. that is by design. That gives us the ability then to put the folding portion of the wings above that smaller tire, giving us really an unbelievable 12-foot transport with Momentum. And folding is easy. There's so many automated systems on Momentum, and the fold is one of them. It's a one-button push. Push and hold the button, it folds. Push and hold the button the other way, it unfolds. As it unfolds, it starts dumping air. As it folds, it starts increasing air in the tires, getting ready for transport or field, whichever it might be. Monitor system in Momentum is Precision's Gen 3 2020. There's not a better monitor available. If you can't understand the information that your monitor is giving you, you can't action upon it. And 2020 is the most intuitive monitor available today. Momentum, the most advanced, most agronomically advanced planting system in the market today. As Jason and Arthur discussed, all those planting issues, Momentum is the solution for every one of them.
Wow, it was really great to learn a little bit more about the all-new Fendt Momentum planter, and just like Larry said, it was designed by farmers. So when we look at the features and all the benefits that the Fendt Momentum planter can bring to growers, it really solves farmers' problems. So now let's head back to the field where Jason will explain to us how we harvested these plots and how we'll collect the agronomic data to share with you.
So now I'm standing in front of our compaction management plots, and what we're trying to do here is demonstrate how we can alleviate soil compaction and some of the effects we've talked about throughout the day today with our Momentum planter. And so this particular plot here, so this is our most severe compaction plot. And what this plot is here is we had our weight transfer system completely turned off, and we also had our planter tire pressure at 55 PSI, so really high. And we're trying to simulate as best as we could with our Momentum planter what a typical planter would be like out on the market today with this plot here. And one thing that we saw earlier in the year that was very evident in this plot, since we did not have a weight transfer system and since our tire pressure was really high, we really saw a dip right in the middle of that planter pass. And so if we looked at the plant height from row 1 to 16, in the middle, we really saw a lot of stunted plants because of all that extra compaction that we had. So now I'm in our controlled traffic plot. And in this particular plot here, we still kept our planter tire pressure low, but all we did was set our weight transfer system to controlled traffic mode. And this mode here is really meant for growers who are already operating in a controlled traffic system. And so what this system allows us to do is bring all the weight to the center inline tandem tires and keep the compaction localized to those two tracks. And so here we're looking at the yield effects in this plot while planting in this controlled traffic mode. So now I'm standing here in our load balance plot. And just like the first two plots, in this particular plot we kept our tractor tire pressure low, our planter tire pressure low, and our weight transfer system was set to load balance mode. So this is really the perfect scenario to completely manage soil compaction from the tractor and planter standpoint by keeping our air pressure low and our weight transfer system in load balance to distribute that weight evenly across the entire planter. And we're really excited about what we were seeing in this plot earlier in the season. When we compared and looked at the rows from 1 to 16, all the rows were very even in terms of plant height across the entire planter pass, compared to one of the first plots I talked about where we had all of this turned off and our planter tire pressure was high, and we saw that dip there in the center in the stunted plants because of the compaction. In this plot we did a really good job of alleviating that, and that's why we were able to see a very consistent plant height across all rows. So with these compaction management plots, the most important information we can collect from this is the yield data. At this particular plot, we're actually going to take a pretty unique approach to harvesting these plots here, and we're actually going to harvest each plot row by row throughout the length of this entire field. And the reason for doing that is because we want to have a good idea of what the yield variation is from row 1 to 16. So we're really excited to be able to look at the yield variability and how we're able to help alleviate soil compaction and bring a better uniform yield across all the rows. And so to other locations, we plan to harvest the center segments out of the planter and compare those to the wing segments. Ideally, we want a uniform yield across all of our rows, and that's what we're trying to do here in these different compaction plots, is to really bring that to you guys. And so we're super excited to get out this fall, harvest all these plots, row by row, or between the center and wing segments, and deliver that yield data to you guys later this year.
First off, we had phenomenal yields at many of our Momentum plots. In fact, in Pontiac, Illinois, in a trial conducted by Precision Planting, Momentum yielded over 250 bushel an acre. Our plot in southeastern Minnesota, Momentum yielded over 260 bushels an acre, and in southeastern South Dakota, Momentum yielded over 210 bushels an acre.
And I can really attest to the South Dakota location, as I live just a few miles south of that plot. And I was really impressed and surprised to see that high of yield, especially considering how dry we got at the end of the year.
As mentioned early, with this year's Fendt Momentum Crop Tour plots, we really set to answer three main questions. First, do we see yield loss in the center section of central field planters? Second, do pinch rows cause yield loss? And third, and last, can we mitigate yield loss even with high capacity center field planter design? Jason, why don't you take us through the results?
Sure thing, Arthur. So first, do we see yield loss in the center section of a central field planter? Well, in order to answer this question, we had to harvest each planter pass out into thirds. So we harvested the wings, center, and wing section so we could compare the overall yield difference between the center and the wings. And what we found was that at 3 out of our 5 crop tour locations, we did not measure any yield difference on average between the center and the wings. Why is this? Well, for starters, we had really good conditions when we planted these plots. But it's also because of the inline tandems of Momentum and the high flotation VF tires equipped with the tire inflation system. At the 4th location, we did see a little bit of a yield difference between the center and the wings, but that was not attributed to the planter, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Secondly, do pinch rows cause yield loss? Well, in order to answer that, we had to harvest some of our compaction plots 1 row at a time with a vintage K2 gleaner.
So you're telling me that the gleaner is like a fine wine that gets better with age?
That's exactly what I'm trying to say. So in order to look at the yield individually between an affected, a non-affected, and a pinch row caused by the tractor, we used that old vintage gleaner and harvested those rows out individually. And after doing that, we found that the answer is absolutely yes. When we restrict the root development on both sides of that plant, we really limit the yield of that individual row, the tractor pinch row. But what was interesting is that what we found is there was really no yield loss in the affected row. So when we only had compaction on one side of that row, we really did not have any yield loss when we compared that to a non-affected row where there was no tire tracks on either side, which was really interesting. And so in order to replicate what most farmers would do, with Momentum, we pulled it with a tractor with row crop duals. So even with no pinch rows caused from the planter, we still had 2 pinch rows caused from that tractor. And as a result of that, you'll notice that there was a yield difference of 10 bushels per acre directly in that tractor pinch row. However, it's important to remember that that's only 2 rows out of 16.
So in other words, Jason, if we look across the entire field, the math comes out to a little shy of 2 bushel an acre in the entire field.
Yep.
So the real question here is, how many pinch rows do you have in your planter and tractor setup? Because the more pinch rows you have, the more money you will lose.
Yes, Arthur, that's exactly what the data would suggest. And so now that we know that it's important to eliminate the effect of pinch rows, this gets us now to our final question, is how do we mitigate the loss created from these high capacity central fill planters? And to answer that, let's go to the final and 5th location, which was conducted up in North Dakota. And if I look back to the day when we planted that trial up there, it was really unfit conditions. It was really wet. We were going to create a lot of compaction that day. And when we showed up and we pulled into plant, we were creating a lot of ruts with our tractor. We had a high tire pressure in our tractor. We were creating a lot of ruts. And we were almost to the point where we were just going to shut it down for the day and wait. The problem is we were really starting to get pretty late in the growing season, and you just never know when it's going to get dry and fit again. And so we felt like we really had to go, but we were really struggling. And so what we did was we dropped the tire pressure in our tractor down to 17 PSI. And by doing that, we were able to spread that, increase the footprint enough of the tractor tire to where we helped with our flotation, and we were creating less ruts. And so we were able to plant that day. The only reason why we could plant that day was because we dropped the tire pressure in our tractor. Now, that's not saying I'm recommending that we can go plant when it's wet because we dropped the tire pressure in our tractor. I'm just saying when we really crunched for time, that's just what we had to do on that day to get it done. And we had a lot of acres that we had to cover. So if we now go back to that location, the results that we found. So this is the one location where we recognized and we found that there was a planter-generated yield loss due to compaction. But how do we know that? Well, it's because when we turn the weight management system on, so when we balance the weight evenly across all 6 tires, we prevented an 8 bushel per acre yield loss in the center section of that planter versus when we turn the system completely off. So ultimately, that equates to about a 3 bushel per acre yield advantage over the entire field.
Well, even at 3 bushel an acre, if we set I'm locking corn at $4 per bushel, that's $12 per acre. So if we're looking at a 2,000 acre farm, that's $24,000 that you pick up there right in the field.
Yep, it really starts to add up. It's also important to remember that this was one location and this is 22-inch corn. So a little bit different than our other locations. So in the first year of field trials, overall, we found that the Load Logic weight management system provided the greatest yield benefit in challenging conditions, which we all know is what often happens when we're dealing in real life situations. So once again, we found about a 3 bushel per acre yield advantage with the Load Logic system in these unfit and challenging conditions where the threat of soil compaction is very high. But it's also important to remember that this is the first year of testing this Load Logic system and the Momentum planter. And we're really excited to continue these studies and these trials in different growing environments, different planting conditions, different soil types in 2021 and beyond. So I know I'm really excited.
So this tells us that even though Momentum features the highest capacity in the industry, we are not sacrificing yield, especially in that center section. As you just saw, we learned a lot from our 5 Fendt Momentum crop tour plots this year. And Jason, to me, there's at least 3 things that we learned and I want our viewers to remember. Number 1, based on 5 crop tour plots that we had this year, we've demonstrated that you don't need to sacrifice yield in order to gain efficiency from a higher capacity planter. Second, there wasn't any yield loss. I said any yield loss from center versus wings of the planter. And traditionally, that's not what we expect, just because of the weight that the center segment carries. From our studies, the Fendt tractor and Momentum planter showed no yield loss, or very little, less than 1 bushel an acre, from wings to center when planting in fit conditions. Third, and lastly, in more challenging wet plant conditions, that's when Fendt Momentum really showed the yield advantage when we had Low Logic weight management system. At our North Dakota plot, we saw the largest advantage in yield. Again, 3 bushel an acre advantage due to Load Logic. This is all the result of a few things that really make our Fendt Momentum planter stand out. Our Low Logic weight management system, which automatically shifts the weight from the center to the wings. Our inline center tandem designs, which completely eliminate pinch rows. The latest technology from Precision Planting, including Downforce, integrated from the factory. And lastly, that even though we are the highest capacity planter in the market, we can achieve it without sacrificing yield.
And remember, this was only our first year of field trials with the Fendt Momentum planter. We're going to continue to build upon these tests and results and share them with you in the future.
To learn more about our results from this year's Fendt Momentum Crop Tour event, visit our website at www.fendt.com/us/planters and click on the Crop Tour heading. And continue to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. In addition, you can pre-order a Fendt Momentum planter for your operation right now. Please visit our website again at www.fendt.com to find your nearest Fendt dealer. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's Fendt, and it's time.